FIT Talks is the oral history program of the Fashion Institute of Technology, directed by Karen Trivett, Head of Special Collections in the library. Today, February 8th, we are taping in the Library of the University at 7th Avenue and 27th Street in Manhattan with David Wolfe. My name is Phyllis Dillon. David Wolfe has recently retired after over 50 years in the fashion business as a pioneering fashion trend forecaster, illustrator, writer, and editor. Building upon his experience in buying fashion illustration and advertising for a Midwest department store, he moved to Great Britain in the 1960s, where he witnessed the London fashion revolution and became an illustrator for leading European department stores and publications. His broad intellectual interests and sophisticated eye led him to conceptualize a firm to publish news reports about Paris fashion collections with Londoner Miss Lee Rudd, called Imaginative Minds International. In 1981, he created a subsequent firm, the Fashion Service, to supply trend information to designers and merchandisers. After returning to the U.S., he joined the Doneger Group as creative director in 1990, where he worked for 27 years. He's had an enormous influence on the fashion industry. I will ask him to discuss pivotal aspects of his career, the significance of fashion trend forecasting, and most importantly, his concerns for the future. So let's begin. David, would you please tell us a bit about where and when you were born and summarize your early interest in fashion?
Okay, I was born in Ohio, and it took me a very, very short time to realize I had to leave Ohio, especially if I wanted a more glamorous life, and I wanted a more glamorous life. And I was always attracted to escapism, I guess, because I grew up in the northern part of Ohio that became the Rust Belt, the industrial Rust Belt. It was so ugly. It gave me a hunger for beauty, and the only place I could find it was in movies and my imagination. So I was very, very interested in fashion art at an early age, because when I was young, a long time ago, every little department store in the country had fashion illustrations that they used to promote the new looks, and basically because they didn't have print mechanisms to represent photography very well, so illustrations could be doctored to reproduce well. So I, very, very early, I can remember being sort of 10 or 11 years old and waiting for the Sunday newspaper so I could see all the fashion illustrations and copy them, and that's really how I started my dream to be a fashion illustrator, but to do it in a different way, I think, because I was more interested in the total image than in, the dress with 6 buttons or whatever.
Right, and then you came to New York at a certain point to find your fortune?
Well, I had several false starts. I came to New York with my kid sister, who was 3 years younger than I, and she'd grown up as a tomboy, the perfect son for my father. She could pass that football, and I was doing fashion illustration. So we had our own gender problem as children. And so I came to New York when she graduated from high school and she tested for the Ford agency, hated it, and I was even more deeply involved in fashion and beauty and things. So I went back to Ohio, where I'd started my career in a little family-owned chain of department stores, and became a very, very big fish in a very, very small pond. So small it was a puddle, not a pond. But it was great training for me, because in this little chain of department stores, I was, well, for one thing, I was young, and fashion was turning young at that point with the youthquake exploding everywhere. And the family who owned the department stores, God bless them, gave me free rein to do whatever I wanted to do because I was young and enthusiastic and curious. So I became, for a while, the visual merchandise director. I wrote advertising copy. I was the teen fashion coordinator. I did the bridal fashion shows. I did everything. And the most important thing I did for my career really wasn't about my career at all. It was romantic. I fell madly in love with a British girl who was, strangely enough, working in Ashtabula, Ohio, as the cosmetics buyer. And she was there because she'd come to America to be in the circus. And she fell off an elephant in Ashtabula, Ohio, and the circus moved on, and she stayed. And I was just nuts about her. And it was the time of the Beatles, and anybody British was fabulous in everybody's eyes. And we got married and went to London to meet her family and to experience the swinging London scene, which of course I knew all about. And I never came back.
Yeah. So tell us about what happened when you went to London, because it was so important for your career.
Absolutely. I mean, when I look back, it looks like I planned my career trajectory brilliantly. I didn't. I just happened to always seem to be in the right place at the right time, meeting the right people. And that's what happened with my wife, Sheila, who got me to London in the first place. And she was also a great stage mother. Gypsy Rose Lee's mother had nothing on Sheila, who was very, very determined that I was going to become the best fashion illustrator I possibly could. And so she stage mothered my career. And when we went to London, just for what I thought was just going to be a short visit of a couple weeks, she commanded me to take my portfolio of the fashion campaigns I'd been doing for this little podunk town newspapers. And I didn't want to do it because I used to be very shy, and I just had stage fright, and she didn't make allowances for that. She said, all right, take your portfolio. When you get to London, I want you to call up people and show them your work, and they'll criticize it, and you'll learn so much, and when you come back, you'll be so much better than you were when we set out. I understood the logic, but I had no intention of doing it. And it came to the end of our holiday, and we had one day left, and she said, you haven't done it yet, do it. And I said, okay, who shall I call? And she said, make a list. She said, a short list of the 10 most important people in London fashion. So I did that, and I said, well, now I start at the bottom and work my way up, and she gave me a great piece of advice that I always pass on to students when I speak to them. She said, no, start at the top. You can always go down easily, but you can't climb up as easily if you start at the bottom. So I called the fashion directrice of what was the finest fashion store in the world at that time, Fortnum Mason. And their fashion director was a woman named Anne Knight, who was known as the most brilliant fashion merchandiser in English fashion, basically because she brought pantyhose to the UK for when she worked for Harrods, and that was her claim to fame. And I don't know what possessed her, but she granted me an interview. And so I got myself all dressed up in my Carnaby Street outfit that I had bought and went in to see her with my portfolio, and so flipped through it and explained to her what I felt was happening in fashion and how it should be promoted and what fashion advertising should be about, which was essentially what came to pass. And I said, the merchandise isn't as important as the image, and you're selling the image, and then you're generating traffic, and therefore they will buy whatever they want to buy, essentially. But they have an image in their mind of what they're doing and buying. And so she liked it, I guess, because when I was finished with my portfolio, I closed it, and she just stared at me. And I started to sweat in my pink flannel suit from Carnaby Street. And she asked me a question that changed my life and maybe changed fashion as a whole. She said, can you go to Paris for me this afternoon? And yes, was the answer. And so she said she had just signed a contract with Emanuel Ungaro to do an exclusive with his first ready-to-wear collection for a year, I think it was. And so she said she had already signed her contract with British Vogue. She would have the opening page of every issue for the next year, and she wanted the Ungaro story to be the first thing. And so she said, all right, you fly to Paris, Emanuel will meet you at the airport. He will have models, and he will have the clothes, the collection, and I'm giving you the front page of British Vogue for the next year. So, would you go back to Ashtabula, Ohio? I don't think so. And so I didn't. And for the next 20 years, I really had so much fun and learned so much, because I not only did advertising for Fortnum Mason, but I worked for the London Sunday Times, the London and Paris bureaus of Women's Wear Daily, and Galeries Lafayette in Paris. So it was just a dream of a job for 20 years. But I got bored. And drawing, things that other people had chosen, because I understood construction, I understood advertising, and I thought I had more to bring to the table than just being an illustrator. And so I was open to ideas, and that's when I met Lee Rudd, and we came up with the idea of the company that she had started only about a year before we met, was a newsletter, in effect, because Americans were so naive about what was happening with we all think that, oh, the swinging 60s happened and everybody embraced it. Well, that is not the case, especially American retailers who were so conservative. And it was a battle for the young explosion that was happening to actually become mainstream. And I think I was part of that force that actually opened up the doors to what was the youthquake.
So both you and Lee sort of figured out the culture of the retail industry, and to some extent, is that accurate? And then figured out how you could supply information. Is that...
Oh yes, and we weren't the only two people. There were several companies that all mushroomed at the same time, because those of us who had connections with the New York industry or the California industry kept getting questions about, well, what restaurant should I go to? Where are there any new shops? I'm coming to London, to see the swinging scene. Where do I find it? And so lots of these little companies were disseminating information about what was happening. And it was like a license to print money. The people were so hungry for that information that was so valuable.
Okay, is it tied to the traditional role that journalists played in talking about Paris, or was it something new?
It was something new because it was a subculture, and it really had its own epicenter. And I remember I used to be so furious with American Vogue compared to British Vogue, because American Vogue just wrote little tidbits about the boutiques, like Sonia Rykiel, for example, and the fact what she was doing was revolutionary. And British Vogue knew how to promote it. American Vogue didn't. And it was frustrating. But we all these little companies that were sending out newsletters in one form or another, all ended up reporting about the same thing. So you didn't have to be a clever journalist. You had to live the life. You had to be in the scene. You had to be walking down the King's Road on Saturday and, have your breath taken away by the originality and the spirit and the sexuality too. I mean, it was very much part of the sexual liberation that put women in the miniskirt. I always thought it was so funny, because when American people would come to London at that time, they thought a miniskirt was one that was above the kneecap. The British knew more.
I think I've read somewhere that, I don't know if it was you or somebody else, said, well, that was the beginning of recognizing that the street was important. Just like absolutely. Now we're so aware of it, but back in the 60s...
Yes, it was like a secret culture, really. And now, because of the internet, everything is transparent. The creativity, what Kim Kardashian is eating for lunch, is a public news. And it wasn't that way. It was very, very much not kept secret, but the Americans weren't curious about it until they started realizing that there was money to be made from turning it into a commercial mainstream expression. But it was not trend forecasting, and it wasn't recognizing trends. It was really just reporting and introducing names and restaurants and boutique hotels and that sort of thing. So I think I was the one who, because of my background being so broad and the fact that I had access to all kinds of insider trading about fashion because of the newspapers I worked with and the magazines and things. So I understood when Kenzo started having fashion shows, and Kenzo is really the person who invented trends as they became, because he understood, evidently, because I didn't know him, but he presented stories on the runway. And most seasons you would kill to see the Kenzo show, or you'd be dead in the water if you missed it. And so by this time, I was blacklisted from most fashion shows because I was, breaking the rules about who you told what to. I thought once it's a fashion show, it should be in public domain and everyone should be excited about it and work with, if they want to work with the ideas, fine, but the Americans didn't copy the ideas, they copied the items. So I got a reputation of being sort of a fashion pirate, which I don't think I deserved, but I think I was helping open doors. I remember, Gianni Versace told me that, that I was one of the reasons that that European ready-to-wear became so popular in America, because there were people like me who were writing about people that America didn't know anything about. Like Armani and Versace before they became Armani and Versace.
So what you're describing really is how the maybe wholesale business was maybe mired in some old-fashioned kind of practices?
You bet. Well, the miniskirt is a perfect example of what went wrong when the miniskirt finally mainstreamed, and those of us in the trend business knew it was time for long skirts. And America, as you know, the John Fairchild fiasco of convincing the American consumer that long skirts were going to be important. They were important in Europe because the fabrics were the right fabrics. They were sexy and sensuous and lightweight and clingy, and America did it in double knit polyester. And so it was awful. And that was typical of the misappropriation of understanding what made European ready to wear so exciting. It had a lot to do with femininity and sexual liberation and rebellion in general. It was preparing for the student rebellions, which happened concurrent to fashion rebellions. And nobody really talks about that. But I remember, when the Paris students rioted, on that day, and I thought this was a major fashion statement, and it changed the attitude. And so trends, instead of being just costume, became attitudinal expressions of the rebellion, not just youth, but anger and passion.
Yes.
And sex. And
so could you describe, while you were in Europe, what the format that this communication took? Were they newsletters that companies subscribed to? Or?
Yes. At the beginning, it was just newsletters and illustrations and things. And photographers were not allowed at most of the fashion shows at the beginning. before they actually took over. So as a fashion illustrator, I was in a perfect position. I remember I would sit in the front row in those days, sketching like crazy everything that came down the runway. And I'm International would do we would print daily reports during the collections, and I would stay awake all night long, fueled by amphetamines, I have to be honest, okay? And we would do sort of a 25 to 50 page sketched report with, about what we had seen. It would get printed, sent off on a courier on a motorcycle to the copy shop, printed, collated in the hotel room. I used to rent a whole floor of a little boutique hotel on the left bank, and we had a staff of about 13 there producing these reports overnight, and then they'd be sent off with couriers to be slid under the hotel doors of our clients who were in Paris and then also Milan. During fashion weeks.
So were your clients only Americans, or were your clients?
It started out only Americans, but it soon changed and it went global. But Japan was very, very important to us.
Now, were these the heads of department stores? Who were the clients?
Okay, the heads of the department stores, yes, of course, but it became much more important for people earlier in the fashion cycle, textile companies, color companies, and designers and design studios. I mean, for a long time, I had a client list that was unbelievable. People who you would think would not need trend inspiration, but as the fashion bubble became bigger and bigger, and it became a bottom line driven industry. So the creative people were really painted into a corner, and I think they still are. I think that's what's one of the things wrong with fashion today, is that the creative people are not esteemed enough to be treated in the right way. I mean, yes, the famous ones are cajillionaires, but the ones who actually do the designing and schlep around the streets looking for the next hot trend are just young people in design studios who are dreaming of being empire builders, but they're not.
And so you lived in Great Britain at the time?
Yes, I was based in Britain, but I traveled 35 weeks of the year for about 10 years. So that's why I never want to get into an airplane again as long as I live.
Yeah. So for your traveling, was that what were you seeing on your travels?
People.
Okay.
That I always, when people say, well, where do you look for trends? It still hasn't changed. Riding the subway in New York is the most exciting experience if you're looking for the next big thing, the next cool thing. That's where you go. I used to travel for the fashion shows, of course, but then I did extracurricular trips just looking for strange things. Like when Mr. Doneger hired me, he just told me, okay, your job is, if you've heard something, get on a plane and go. It was the most wonderful, liberating, endorsement of a creative eye. And the most extravagant gig was for many years, I used to do a month in Saint-Tropez every summer, renting an apartment and then hanging out, watching the yachts come in and the people get off the yachts, and take notes of what color they're wearing on Valentino's yacht at dinner time.
So could you describe, you returned to the United States, and did you have to look for a job, or did
no. I returned to the United States with the company that I had put together, TFS, the fashion service. So it was we always had a New York office, but my gut feeling was that the action was going to, in the industry, was going to be in New York and America, and it was going to be about the business of fashion rather than fashion as it had been as a creative expression. And so that's why I came back, because I knew nothing about what I thought was going to become the driving force of the industry, the sort of big box retailers and the drive for discount merchandise. And so I wanted to be here to learn about it. And that's how I got connected to Doneger, because I convinced them to hire me as a part-time consultant so that I could bring my sense of fashion to them, which they needed, but it also they would provide me with training and understanding of how the industry was going to change.
Yeah.
And,
could you describe what Doneger did back then?
Yes.
For people who don't know.
Okay. Doneger was officially the Henry Doneger Company, and the founder was a real rag trade garment guy, and what he created was a big, lucrative buying office. And there were hundreds of buying offices in New York during the 1950s, and they were really consultants based in New York who worked for local department stores across the country. Every town, little town had mama papa boutiques, and they would have a buying office like Doneger to take care of, often selecting the merchandise for their stores, because they didn't always come to New York, so they needed a presence in New York, and that's what a buying office did. And the Doneger Group, thanks to Henry Doneger and his son Abbey, who's now the president, understood that they had to change with the industry. So when I joined them, they had the major discounters as clients, and it was like a foreign language to me. It was so exciting and challenging. And so many people said, but you're a creative fashion, high fashion guy, how could you be interested? And then I realized that was my Ohio background coming through, that I understood that it was about making money. And it took a while for the luxury market to learn from companies like Kmart on how to build a brand. So it was a challenging, exciting time. And Mr. Doneger got very interested in the idea of trend forecasting and invited me to come and start an in-house trend forecasting company that he could make available to all of his retail clients, but also sell to the market at large.
Yeah.
I guess one could say that the retail landscape generated its own growth by creating the discounters, things like Loehmann's, Corvettes, Alexander's. I mean, as a middle-class girl growing up in the suburbs, I was thrilled by Orbach's and going to Alexander's, where I could buy, trendy things at lower prices. So
I think it's fascinating because it's absolutely true, and that still made sense. What has happened now is that the luxury brands are looking at the street, and the street doesn't look so good. But once a luxury brand takes over, it has the cachet of the label. I think the company that really invented this entire crazy dichotomy was Prada, because Miuccia Prada really was an unknown force, and through clever manipulation of the media, it was like the emperor's new clothes, and it still is. We pretend that it's very, very, very important, and it's no longer important in the way that it was.
Yeah, there's been, I guess, in your career, you've seen a serious transformation from the traditional Paris couture dominating and the trickle-down theory of the extension of fashion ideas, to something else.
Yes, I think when fashion stopped being the pursuit of beauty and perfection, then the fashion world changed, and so many people who are part of the fashion world don't recognize that it's a different place, a totally alien landscape compared to what it was when I began my career in fashion. I'm angry. They like pulled the rug out from under me, and the rug was gorgeous.
Yeah, I could see how that would feel.
Yes. I mean, when Valentino is making track pants as a high fashion statement, there is something wrong with the perception. I mean, yes, they're cool, but why would you buy Valentino's version of track pants?
So what you're describing is how the market has changed the high end to a degree.
Yes, and I think it's, in a way, I think it's right, because I think two things are now concurrently happening. I think fashion with a capital F is becoming more and more an accepted art form, and it's wonderful, and it's creative, and it's innovative, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with what people really wear. And what people really wear is very, very exciting, because that's why the track pant is there. It's comfort, it's modern, it's high tech, and people are moving. I think the current women's movement is a little piece of this. I think when you consider that 7-inch stiletto high heels have been the fashion shoe for 10 years now, and nobody wears it really except people on TV. Or fashion editors who, change their shoes before they get out of the limo at a fashion show.
Okay, so this is very, very interesting, because you're describing a sort of the achievement of sort of democratization
Yes.
in people's choices for dress, but it's also resulted in changes where the industry is sort of running after the people.
Yes. I mean, the old adage that the customer is always right takes on dire results, because there's a difference between a designer and a shopper. And I never understand why people want focus groups, because I think Diana Vreeland was so right when she said something, paraphrasing, that she gave people what they wanted before they knew what it was that they wanted. And now we are giving people what mass culture wants. And what would Babe Paley wear today? God knows. I can't picture her in track pants and a hoodie. Can you?
No.
And I don't want to hang out with people who wear track pants and a hoodie. I want to hang out with the ghost of Babe Paley.
Well, there are some glimmers of hope, right? I mean, the popularity of vintage and the young people's appreciation, concern about sustainability.
Yes. I mean, when people talk about, is fashion dying, or, are trends forgotten or something, that can't ever happen, because fashion truly does reflect the society. And when you think of what fashion is today and what's going on in society, it's the perfect match. It is perfect expression of the chaos and the terror and the greed, all kinds of unattractive attributes, not poetry and artistry and culture. Pop culture, well, there's no such thing as regular culture anymore. There is only pop culture.
Yes, I knew that you were...
You pressed my buttons, you naughty woman.
Yeah, I didn't... Before we talk more about the future of fashion, or or the problems. Could you describe how trend forecasting, or well, how does a place like Doneger's and trend forecasters help various parts of the industry figure out what they should be making?
Yes. Well, I think the beauty of trend forecasting is that it's really what happened to creativity, and it had to become much more realistic and bottom line oriented because of the people who took over the fashion industry. The same thing has happened to fashion that happened to the movie industry when the accountants came in and took over. And I think that's what Doneger does. It brings a creative eye to the financial reality of what can be made and what can be sold. I mean, when Prada started showing raw hemlines, I mean, okay, so we're told that's creative and cool. Is it, or is it just a way to save money and still charge a high price? You know? So I think trend forecasting today is really not forecasting trends. It's really analyzing what's going to sell. And that isn't how trend forecasting used to work. Trend forecasting used to introduce ideas or pull together concepts and influences and then demonstrate how that could be turned into an expression of fashion.
So, on the one hand, one could look at the globalization of fashion and the informality of fashion that most people subscribe to now all over the world. The ubiquitous of jeans and T-shirts.
There is no reason to travel looking for fashion trends anymore because there is just one big fashion trend, and it's expressed in China and Japan and California and Toronto all at the same time. So I think the globalization of fashion has changed the landscape. So anyone with 20/20 vision can tell you what the trends are. And they're not changing, they're tweaked bit by bit. And I don't see that changing. I mean, I retired at the moment that I was about to do my spring 2019 forecast. And the only thing that really excited me was the immigration from Earth to Mars. And I think, a real trend forecaster right now would be working on what would be appropriate as functional and exciting and glamorous to wear on Mars. Absolutely. We've got to really make a quantum leap ahead to get over this kind of dreariness that is holding fashion hostage.
Okay, so that the uniforms that we now and the interest in comfort and relaxation has created dreariness, and but do you see some glimmers of hope?
I think fashion has never been as exciting. Fashion as an art is more creative, more liberated, more outrageous, more beautiful, but it isn't rippling down into the real world.
I see. So the people attracted to design bring a lot of talent and interest and
get nowhere with it, because it won't make enough money. I mean, they should not try to be empire builders. They should be luxury brands, and and express. I mean, no one really expects a fine artist to be a millionaire, and yet that happens. So there's something wrong with the system. We have to fix that somehow. And I think, you know, I liken it to the music industry. I mean, if you watch the Grammy Awards these days, you would think, what on earth is going on? Cole Porter and Richard Rodgers could have never found a home in pop culture because it is so brainless.
Have you worked with students, and do you, because it seems to me that some of them are figuring this out, some of the young people.
Oh, I think so.
They've readjusted their ambitions.
Yes.
I
think there's a healthy opportunity for creative expression, and it's to take it back to the music industry. Then you have, you know, the Grammys and rap as, you know, the major cultural force, but there's still opera being performed and appreciated and newly created, and I think that the fashion as art is so exciting and stimulating and wonderful. I mean, even when it's crazy stupid, it's great that it happens, but it can't be. There are like two separate industries going on, and I think when you've got vintage clothing and the influence of vintage clothing being worked and reworked, it's like it's a car that you turn the key in the ignition and it almost starts, but it doesn't. I don't mean to sound negative, because I'm really very optimistic about fashion as art, and and if I were looking to begin my career now, I would not go there. I would go to the one that's going to dress the pioneers who go to Mars. They're the ones I would be passionately interested in.
Yes, like this company that just sent the biggest rocket into space just last week, which is an exciting prospect.
And that will not be talked about at the fashion collections of the various fashion weeks that are happening. I mean, I cannot believe that the people in fashion aren't paying enough attention to the outside world when they should be seeking ways to express what's going on in the outside world.
Okay, well, this has been a very interesting discussion, and I want to thank you very much for sharing your views with us, and wish you lots of...
Well, I have to come back 10 years from now and see whether my views hold water.
Right. Thank you very much for coming to FIT
Well, thank
today.
you for inviting me.